President, I rise in opposition to Senate Bill 992. And through you, Madam President, I have just a couple of questions for our good senator.
Please proceed.
Through you, Madam President, under this bill, I get the sense that this creates an unfunded mandate, one that requires town legislative bodies to report all local law enforcement interactions with ICE to OPM each month. It appears to me that that will be a burden to already stressed towns. I was wondering if there's any thought or consideration in terms of the impact to our local communities in terms of the cost for this unfunded mandate. Through you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Logan. Senator Winfield.
Through you, Madam President, I'm not quite sure how the senator imagines that cost. I assume that the local law enforcement agencies have that information. All that this suggests is that that information should be turned over. If the senator wants to tell me why he thinks it's the burden that he suggests, I would be happy to respond to that.
Senator Logan.
Through you, Madam President. Well, the requirement now that this information be provided each month, I would imagine that it would require certain new standards for that information and for the reporting requirements that do not exist now. Through you, Madam President.
Senator Winfield.
Through you, Madam President, I suppose anything that we do is a burden, but I'm not sure if we have information and it's required to be turned over, if communicating in any form that we normally communicate is a burden that I would suggest was overly burdensome for the local law enforcement agency. And I think we should be in a position where information is transparent in this state. Through you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Winfield. Senator Logan.
Thank you, Madam President. Through you, I have another question. In terms of training for law enforcement, this bill, as I read it, as I understand it, we will be looking for our local law enforcement now to be trained on not how to work with the federal government or federal law enforcement, but we will need to train our local law enforcement on ways to not work with the federal government. That training, my question is, will that come from the Office of Policy and Management? Is that something that we envision having to perhaps hire some professionals that are versed in how to do this type of training? What is envisioned for this retraining of our local law enforcement who have built their careers for their own careers, for decades in terms of the history of local law enforcement? I'll speak for Connecticut, here in Connecticut, working in conjunction with our federal government.
Thank you, Senator Logan. Senator Winfield.
Through you, Madam President, I don't see the bill the way apparently the good senator sees the bill. This bill would not require that our law enforcement agents not be trained not to work with the federal government. Should the law enforcement agents from the federal government get a warrant, they would still be working with them. Should they choose to go under subsection E that we've talked about in lines 159 through 169, they would be working with them. And it doesn't cost a lot not to do something. Through you, Madam President.
Senator Logan.
Thank you, Madam President. I have just a few statements to make now. You know, this legislative body has a history of, as most legislative bodies do, coming up with laws that some are good, some are bad, some have good intentions, but sometimes result in unintended consequences. When you take a look at the Trust Act that we're now revising, it was originally created to address and to deal with an issue that we have. That issue is immigration. Here in the United States of America, currently we have an immigration problem. That issue needs to be corrected and fixed at the federal level. As a country, we've been unsuccessful in fixing our immigration policies here in the United States of America. And as a result, we are where we are now as a state, trying to figure out a way to make this work in the meantime until the federal government gets its act together. So what are we doing there? We have tens of thousands of undocumented persons, not hundreds of thousands of undocumented persons here in our state. And it is our responsibility to make sure that every person whose feet are in our state and on our soil are safe and protected. It is important that we understand that what we're doing with the Trust Act, and now these proposed revisions to the Trust Act, is to address the inability of our federal government to deal with the immigration issue here in the United States of America. Now, when I look at the immigration and our situation here now, millions upon millions of undocumented persons here in the United States, certainly I do not believe that we can just deport by the tens of millions of people out of the United States of America. That is not what I'm interested in doing. I believe that we should have a real, modern immigration policy at the federal level that provides for a path, an achievable path for people to gain either their residency here in the United States, work permits, or citizenship if they're willing to go through the long and arduous process, as I think it should be. I think as a country, there are many jobs that I believe that immigrants can and should provide. Folks should be able to obtain work visas here and then go back to their country. But they can't do that right now. So as a result, we have a number of folks, some are fleeing persecution, some are fleeing because of the safety issue in their home countries, wanting to come somewhere where it's safe, somewhere where there's more opportunities than where they come from. But make no bones about it, we are talking about persons that are here illegally, undocumented. And we must be humane in terms of how we treat every human being in our state. It is important, though, that we respect the laws of the United States of America. It is important that we understand that undocumented persons are not U.S. residents. They are not United States citizens. They are not afforded the same rights as U.S. citizens or U.S. residents. That is just a fact. That is not something that's based on, it's not subjective, it is a fact. But again, because of our issue at the federal level, we need to make adjustments here to deal with this crisis here in Connecticut. Now, when I take a look from my own experience, and I look at my own family, this really comes home for me in a very, very real way. For me, I can go way back to 1893 That's when my grandfather, on my mother's side, was born. A long time ago, but that is when he was born. He was born in Bluefields, Nicaragua. And his plan, even back then when he was in his 20s, his plan was to come to the United States. He traveled from Nicaragua, through Honduras, made it to Guatemala. Same kind of patterns you're hearing now from a lot of folks. But when he got to Guatemala, he ran into my grandmother. And they fell in love. And they got married. Had 9 children. In the 1960s, the United States of America was doing a lot of international country fixing, if you will. And the U.S. Army had a presence in Guatemala, who's now my uncle. He happened to live in New Haven, Connecticut. And he fixed helicopters. He didn't fly the helicopters, but he fixed the helicopters for the Army. And he was stationed in Guatemala, Central America. He met my aunt. They fell in love, got married. My aunt moved to Connecticut. When my aunt moved to Connecticut, my grandmother decided she wanted to move to Connecticut because she spoke English all her life. Because my grandmother's parents, one was from Jamaica and one was from Guatemala. And when she came, since she was the matriarch of the family, my mother came. Other aunts and uncles came to Connecticut. My father and my uncle tell me the story that when my mother came in the mid-60s to Connecticut, she was able to obtain her visa. She came here. My father said, he was just about 30, that's the love of my life. And if she's in the United States of America, I've got to be where she is. So he obtained his visa, travel visa, and he hopped on a plane. Now in Guatemala, you can travel from one end of Guatemala to the other on a bus in about 16 hours, a small country. My father flew, cheapest flight you can find, flew to Miami, called my uncle, said, I'm in the United States of America, come pick me up. My uncle thought he was in JFK naturally, but he was in Miami. So my uncle had to rent a van and jump in a van and drive down to Florida to pick him up. Brought him up here. My parents spent the 70s going back and forth, eventually getting work visas, having folks vouch for them as good people. My parents obtained their U.S. residency. My father, who graduated from a sixth grade education, worked multiple jobs in New Haven, worked his way, eventually worked in a factory in North Haven, American Crucible, which no longer exists. My mother worked her way up, went to school for a while, ended up working as a secretary. They called them secretaries back there, the work that she was doing. And they worked hard, and they went through the process. It took a while. But as time has gone on, it's become harder and harder for folks, particularly from the Latin American countries, to find that path for U.S. citizenship. That needs to be fixed. So when we look here at the state of Connecticut and what to do as a state to this issue, we have to be careful that we do not make a knee-jerk reaction. We don't come up with this terrible bill language that goes too far. It's one thing to come up with policies and procedures and ways to help those individuals that are here, undocumented, peacefully, perhaps fleeing persecution. many wanting to just find a better life for themselves and their family and their children. We need to make sure that we don't sacrifice the rights and the safety of U.S. residents, U.S. citizens, folks that are living and working and paying taxes here in Connecticut. To have a bill, and I believe the title of this bill is a misnomer. I don't believe that this is a trust act anymore with the revisions that we're proposing here. This bill should be titled Connecticut, Sanctuary State. That is what this bill does, in my opinion. When I talk to folks in my district, I say, hey, what do you feel about a sanctuary city? He says, well, I don't really know what that is. So many will say, they say, but I hear New Haven considers himself a sanctuary city. Because you're not going to find a definition or a legal document or a law somewhere that defines what a sanctuary city is. But it's a state of mind. It's a matter of leadership in that particular city, telling their population, telling the world that we welcome undocumented persons. And we'll do all that we can, even if it means working in contrary to the federal government. And they say, oh, okay. Well, I say, well, how do you feel about a sanctuary city? Hey, what do you think about the idea of Hamden becoming a sanctuary city? Oh my gosh, Hamden? Sanctuary city? Are you kidding me? Our mill rate is through the roof. We're having a hard time paying our own bills now. How are we going to make Hampton a sanctuary city? Oh my goodness, no way. I say the same thing in Ansonia. Oh my goodness, no way. Derby. Imagine Woodbridge as a sanctuary city. Bethany, Connecticut, sanctuary city. Beacon Falls, sanctuary city. Naugatuck, sanctuary city. Preposterous. But this bill, in my opinion, will make the entire state of Connecticut a sanctuary state. When we tell our local law enforcement not to work with the federal government, we are going the wrong way. Now, what does that mean? Remember, we here are legislators, leaders of this state. We are coming up with policy, coming up with policies, making up laws that have a lasting effect. And we have to look at all of the details of the language of these bills that we're coming through. We have to think about what may be some of the unintended consequences of the laws that we draw up. So some of you may find this far-fetched, but I do not believe it's far-fetched, and I believe it's a fact. You could look at other countries who have similarly gone down this route. What do I mean by that? Well, you start with creating laws on the books telling our law enforcement, I don't want you to share information with the federal government. We're state legislators. We know what you should be doing, and we don't think you should be working with the federal government. Let them figure it out for themselves. Well, you know what happens there? You do something like that, the federal government is going to sit by here and just not execute federal laws. Have you ever heard of a federal police? That is a foreign concept to us here. We have local police. Other countries have local police, federal police, and they have their local army. And when you get into that kind of mix, look at Mexico, look at Guatemala, look at Venezuela. That's the problem you have. I'd much rather work with our local police, have our local police continue to work with the federal government. I'd much rather have us, as a state, voters, demand from our congressional delegation that they do their job in Washington. and fix the immigration problem we have here in the United States. Instead of us coming up with bad bills, perhaps with good intentions, but the actual language of this bill, in my opinion, is horrible and can have a lasting effect. I think it's important that we as a body really consider what we're doing here. Keep in mind that this is a state that currently has many problems that we need to address. This issue, this bill, is misguided. This bill will send us further down a path beyond what I believe is good for our state. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator. Will you remark further on the bill as amended?